In the news tonight, His Majesty the King cables Egypt's newly elected President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to congratulate him over his landslide victory and voices confidence in his ability to lead Egypt to a better future. Heavy turnout calls for a 5-hour extension in Syria's presidential election, the first time in half a century that voters are offered a choice of candidates. And US President Barack Obama promises to beef up military support for Eastern European members of the NATO alliance in light of the Kremlin's intervention in Ukraine and the ongoing crisis. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. His Majesty the King has congratulated Egypt's elected President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi for the confidence the nation has placed in him. In a cable to Sisi following his landslide victory in presidential election, King Abdullah voiced confidence in Sisi's ability to lead the country towards a better future, one that befits the pivotal status of Egypt on the Arab and regional levels. His Majesty said he is keen to further strengthen the historic ties between the two brotherly nations and to continue consultation on various Arab and Islamic issues. Earlier on the announcement of election results, His Majesty telephoned Sisi and congratulated him on the victory. Sisi had secured a victory of 96.91% in last week's vote. The Election Commission said turnout was about 47% of Egypt's 54 million voters, less than the 40 million votes that Sisi had expected. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour reiterated his government's full support to the Independent Election Commission as he received at his office its chair and members and congratulated them for the royal confidence. A new board chaired by Riyad al-Shak'a was sworn in before His Majesty the King in early May. Al-Shak'a briefed the Prime Minister on current challenges facing the Commission and voiced hope that all state institutions, as well as civil society and political parties, would cooperate together in the future to enhance the kingdom's democratic and reform process. Members of the Commission said they have revisited the last parliamentary elections and reviewed with other stakeholders the gaps that occurred, pointing out that work is underway to bridge those gaps on the legal and procedural levels. Mansour commended the Commission for the reputable status it has gained on the regional level and praised its successful handling of the last parliamentary and municipal elections. Pledges to work with the newly formed Palestinian Unity government are pouring in. The United Nations this afternoon welcomed the formation of the new Palestinian Unity government and said it is ready to lend its full support. A UN spokesman said the Secretary General welcomed the new government on the basis of assurances provided both publicly and to the United Nations by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas that his government will continue to honor previous agreements.
The United Nations stands ready to lend its full support to the newly formed government in its effort to reunite the West Bank and Gaza in line with the intra-Palestinian Unity Agreement of April 23rd under one legitimate Palestinian authority, including by addressing the serious political, security, humanitarian, and economic challenges in Gaza and holding long overdue elections. The Secretary General counts on a constructive approach by regional stakeholders and hopes the international community will not relent in its support to the development of Palestinian economy and the Israeli-Palestinian peace.
The European Union also said it will work with the new Palestinian Unity government sworn in yesterday on condition it sticks to the principle of peace with Israel based on a two-state solution. A statement issued by the EU said its engagement with the new Palestinian government will be based on its adherence to previous policies and commitments. The announcement by the EU and the United Nations come a day after the US administration said it would work with the Palestinian Unity government. Washington's announcement has set the United States on a new collision course with Israel, which has shunned the new cabinet in the Palestinian territories. Voting in Syria's presidential election was extended by 5 hours due to heavy turnouts and long queues of voters. As Syrians vote in an election expected to deliver victory for President Bashar al-Assad, the conflict is far from being over. The Syrian president is running against two relatively unknown challengers who were approved by parliament. This is the first time in half a century Syrians have been offered a choice of candidates. Here's more.
Voters in and outside Syria head to the polls. Security is tightened as the presidential election takes place in the midst of a crisis. Tens of thousands of people have died and millions more have been displaced in the past 3 years since the uprising began. But in the capital, Damascus, President Bashar al-Assad is widely expected to win a third 7-year term in office.
It is the smallest duty to vote by blood. I think the elections are the best way to express our opinion. We are with President Bashar al-Assad until the end of our lives.
Officials say the vote is a way to resolve the crisis.
The big majority of Syrians feels that this aggressive crisis should end and they must get out of what happened and that what was happening should not continue. The majority of Syrians are convinced that the key to the end of the crisis will be the presidential elections.
Abroad, Lebanese authorities deployed heavy security at the checkpoint in anticipation of violence that has plagued the neighboring country for more than 3 years. Refugees in Arsal are doubting the integrity of the vote.
The election in Syria is a complete farce. Bashar is the killer of children and the reason behind millions being homeless and 200,000 in prison. Starvation and destitution and bombings. I don't know on what basis this person is electing himself.
Here in Jordan, Syrians living in the Zaatari refugee camp said they are opposed to the presidential elections that are set to extend Bashar al-Assad's rule.
أبناء مخيم الزعتري لا لانتخابات لبشار الأسد.
The people living in Zaatari are opposed to Bashar al-Assad's elections. Bashar al-Assad fell a long time ago, so it's done and there are no elections. We are saying to Arab nations that it is enough of this disrespect. How is it possible to have elections with Bashar al-Assad? Didn't they say Bashar al-Assad has fallen?
Critics of the Syrian government, though, denounced the election as a sham. It is the first time in decades that more than one name has appeared on the ballot paper. The other two candidates, Mahir Hajjar and Hassan al-Nouri, are not widely known. The Interior Ministry says there are nearly 16 million eligible voters, both inside and outside Syria. But with many parts of the country either under rebel control or in areas being fought over, voting is only taking place in government-held territory like Damascus, where voters are only too happy to show their support for Assad. Farah Ajlouni for the news at 10.
Saudi Arabia said a review of health data has identified an additional 113 confirmed cases of the deadly Middle East respiratory syndrome MERS, bringing the total to 688 cases. The additional cases have not been previously recorded. A statement by the Health Ministry said the death toll in Saudi from the virus has risen to over 280 from 190. Meanwhile, the Saudi Deputy Health Minister has been sacked for his handling of the virus after being in the job for only 6 weeks. It is the second sacking of a Saudi health minister in less than 2 months. His predecessor was also sacked when the rate of new infections started to rise rapidly in mid-April. The health ministry has been under criticism by international scientists for what they saw as a reluctance to collaborate with some specialist labs around the world, offering to help investigate the possible source of the virus and explore how it spreads. New Libyan Prime Minister Ahmed Matiq held his first cabinet meeting at the Prime Ministry's office after police forces helped him take over the building. Libya is struggling with turmoil and a political crisis, as outgoing Prime Minister Abdullah Thani has refused to hand over power to Matiq, who was elected in a chaotic vote by Parliament last month. Thinney resigned in April but has said he received conflicting orders from Parliament over the legitimacy of Matiq's election and would continue in his post until the General Congress Assembly resolved the dispute. In a brief statement after the cabinet meeting, Matiq denounced clashes between militant Islamists and army forces that have erupted in Benghazi. He vowed to make improving security and fighting terrorism a top priority. Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan described CNN correspondent Ibn Watson a flunky and an agent in reference to Watson's coverage of anti-government protests in Istanbul on Saturday. Istanbul police had interrupted a live CNN broadcast and briefly held Watson as he was covering the first anniversary of Turkey's anti-government protests. In a speech to Parliament aired live on TV channels, Erdogan said the international media made exaggerated, provocative calls during the coverage, adding that they were far from a free, impartial, independent press. Erdogan has repeatedly accused the foreign media and governments of having a hand in the protests, which have been going on since last June. According to a Turkish government official, Watson was only held for a few minutes because he was not carrying his passport. U.S. President Barack Obama promised to beef up military support for Eastern European members of the NATO alliance in light of the Kremlin's intervention in Ukraine. Obama unveiled plans to spend up to $1 billion in supporting and training the armed forces of NATO states on Russia's borders. The White House also said it would review permanent troop deployments in Europe as the Ukraine crisis continues. Immediately after landing at Warsaw's airport at the start of a 4-day visit to Europe, Obama headed to an aircraft hangar to inspect U.S. fighter jets in Poland for a joint program with the Polish Air Force. He said there's a need to ensure that the collective defense is ready and is properly equipped.
Given Russia's actions in Ukraine, NATO has increased its presence across the region from the Baltics to the Black Sea. I thank our allies for the contributions they're making, and I'll be discussing the initiative that I announced today to bolster the U.S. presence in Europe. A number of countries represented here have already committed to increasing their investments in our collective defense, and today we'll be discussing additional steps that we can take both as individual nations and as an alliance to make sure we have the capabilities that we need.
In Brussels, meanwhile, defense ministers of the 28-member alliance are meeting to consider what longer steps it needs to bolster its eastern defenses. NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen praised the announcement by the United States that it would review its military presence in Europe. He also said a long-term plan to bolster NATO's collective defense provisions could be agreed at a summit of alliance leaders in Wales in September, possibly including changes in troop deployments.
I really appreciate the American leadership in taking reassurance measures. The United States has reacted swiftly after Russia's illegal military actions in Ukraine. We have taken immediate measures, and we are now considering more long-term measures to reinforce collective defense, and that might include update of defense plans, development of new defense plans, enhanced exercises, and also appropriate deployments. But I would expect such a readiness action plan to be adopted at the summit.
And in eastern Ukraine, fighting raged for the second straight day as the army rolled out an offensive against pro-Russia separatists holding the city of Slavyansk, with dead and wounded on both sides. Rebels in the town, a fierce separatist stronghold where a military helicopter was shot down last week, killing 14 servicemen, said they have brought down an aircraft and a helicopter, but this was denied by Ukrainian authorities. 12 hours after Kiev's forces launched an overnight military operation in and around Slavyansk, a spokesman for the Ukrainians said 2 were killed and 42 wounded. Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy held an extraordinary cabinet meeting to set out the steps for Prince Felipe to succeed his father. Rajoy challenged critics calling for a referendum on the monarchy to take the matter to court. Since there is no clear-cut procedure to handle an abdication, the transition will probably be accomplished by passing a law through Parliament, where the ruling Conservative People's Party has an absolute majority. The smaller leftist parties all called for a referendum on the monarchy. Meanwhile, Spanish King Juan Carlos and Crown Prince Felipe attended a military ceremony, the first public event since the king announced he is abdicating the throne to his son. As the royals arrived at El Escorial Monastery, Prince Felipe stepped out of the car, but King Juan Carlos was helped to his feet. The Prime Minister had said the king is stepping down for personal and health reasons. Harriet Thompson not only became the oldest woman to run the San Diego Rock and Roll Marathon, but also broke a U.S. record in her age group. Harriet Thompson is 91. It took her 7 hours to complete the 42.19-kilometer race. Thompson started running back in 1999 when a friend of hers was running to raise money to fight cancer.
My favorite part's at the end. When I get over that finish line, that's the best part.
The International Broadcast Center for the FIFA World Cup was inaugurated in Barra da Tijuca in the west zone of Rio de Janeiro. The media center will act as the main hub for all broadcast operations in Brazil during the World Cup, which begins in 9 days. It will be linked to all 12 venues in Brazil and hundreds of broadcasters around the world. Some 15,000 media representatives have been accredited for the IBC this year. The IBC is intended to leave a legacy beyond the FIFA World Cup in terms of advanced telecommunications infrastructure, which can be used for future events. And as 32 teams are preparing to battle it out in the World Cup, another pitched battle will be taking place in Brazil. It's Adidas versus Nike. Here's more.
Ready to play a starring role on the pitch in Brazil, and I'm not talking about the players. The Brazuca's the match ball for the Football World Cup. It's made by Adidas. The German firm supplied the tournament's official ball since 1970 and has extended World Cup sponsorship until 2030.
We're selling millions and millions of balls. Then we have the ball boys, we have the referees, we have the billboards, we have 9 teams. So we are very, very present. And obviously through our partnership with the FIFA, we have special occasions where we as the only sport brand can be, which gives us exclusivity. So hopefully we will also have a team who will win the World Cup.
Adidas is supplying 9 teams, including reigning champions Spain, Germany and Argentina. But it's being tackled by a new rival. For the first time, US sportswear brand Nike is kitting out more teams, 10 in total, including hosts and favourites Brazil. Adidas has traditionally been the top-selling brand in football and expects to make a record €2 billion from the sport this year, whereas Nike predicts it'll make €1.5 billion.
This is a head-to-head race between them and us about the market leadership in football, but we are still clearly ahead of them.
Nike's also sponsoring some of the world's best-known players. It's signed 6 of the 10 most marketable footballers in the world, like Portugal's Cristiano Ronaldo to Adidas's 3. And that's where it can get complicated.
Lionel Messi is plays for FC Barcelona, and therefore their kit is manufactured by Nike. However, he's sponsored by Adidas, who also sponsor his national team. So you can see how this starts to become difficult commercially and legally.
During the World Cup, Adidas has a privileged position as the official sportswear sponsor, meaning Nike needs to be creative to grab attention.
Nike, on the other hand, will have tendered for that process, but have not won. So they then have a commercial decision to make of how then best to avoid the long list of regulations and laws that are in place to prevent what we would term ambush marketing.
Marketing experts won't just be watching the action on the pitch in Brazil, but who comes out on top in the battle between two of the world's biggest sporting brands.
And finally, fair weather tonight with partly cloudy skies and northwesterly moderate winds. Tomorrow, a rise in temperature is expected with a high of 34 degrees in Amman to become 4 to 5 degrees above seasonal average. Winds will be southeasterly moderate, and the Gulf of Aqaba should expect moderate conditions tonight, but hot tomorrow with northerly moderate to fresh winds and calm seas. Here now is the temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, here's a reminder of the day's top stories. His Majesty the King cables Egypt's newly elected President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to congratulate him over his landslide victory and voices confidence in his ability to lead Egypt to a better future. Heavy turnout calls for a 5-hour extension in Syria's presidential election, the first time in half a century that voters are offered a choice of candidates. And U.S. President Barack Obama promises to beef up military support for Eastern European members of the NATO alliance in light of the Kremlin's intervention in Ukraine and the ongoing crisis. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Ali Taqan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.